Imagine a political dynasty so, deeply entrenched that an entire generation of voters has literally never known another reality.
Yeah, that's hard to even picture in today's political climate.
I mean, we are talking about a government that has won 5 consecutive elections. 5. For 16 uninterrupted years, they have defined the laws, shaped the culture, and just maintained this massive, unyielding grip on power.
Right. 16 years is an eternity in modern politics.
Exactly. And the streets are clean, the economy is humming, the borders are locked down tight.
Yeah.
To any outside observer, it just looks like an impenetrable fortress.
It looks permanent, like it's just the way things are.
Right. But then in the span of roughly 60 days, that entire fortress is completely dismantled.
Just wiped out.
And not by a violent revolution or like an invading army, but by a 43-year-old politician promising hope and change who just steps in and immediately begins rewriting the country's constitution.
It completely shatters the conventional wisdom of how political change actually happens.
Yep.
I mean, you don't expect a load-bearing wall of a nation's political architecture to just, well, evaporate overnight.
You really don't.
You expect a gradual shift,
Yeah.
right? Like a slow realignment of demographic preferences over a decade or two. But what we are examining today in this deep dive is the political equivalent of a massive, sudden sinkhole.
A sinkhole is the perfect word for it.
The ground simply gave way, and the aftershocks are currently fracturing the entire landscape of European politics with really direct implications for the United States as well.
That is exactly why we are dissecting this today. We are looking at a massive political earthquake in Central Europe, specifically in Hungary.
Right.
And our entire roadmap for this deep dive is a recent, really extensive interview from the Rubin Report featuring Balázs Orbán. And right at the top, let's clear up a crucial detail for you listening, as this gets confusing.
Oh, yeah, we definitely need to clarify the names.
Balázs Orbán is a Hungarian member of parliament and an incoming member of the European Parliament. He served as the political director to the recently ousted Prime Minister, Viktor Orbán, but they are not related.
Right. Not brothers, not cousins.
Exactly. They just happen to share a last name.
It's a vital distinction. Because what we are getting here is an insider's postmortem. I mean, he was the political director for the very administration that just lost power.
So he was literally in the room where it happened.
Exactly. So what we have in this source material is a real-time, highly granular critique of a paradigm shift coming from someone who spent years building the exact paradigm that was just overthrown.
Now, as we dig into this, we have to recognize that we are looking at this through Balázs Orbán's highly specific, deeply conservative lens.
Yes, that is very important to state.
We really need to be clear here. Our goal today isn't to validate the former Fidesz administration, nor are we here to attack Peter Magyar's new incoming coalition. We are entirely neutral on this.
Absolutely. We are not taking sides at all.
We are strictly mapping out Orbán's blueprint of this massive shift so we can understand the mechanics of what he claims is happening to Western politics. We want to understand his arguments about how a 16-year stronghold fell, the aggressive constitutional moves the new government is making, and those massive geopolitical shockwaves touching the EU, the migration crisis, and the war in Ukraine.
The baseline context is just everything here. Because in a modern parliamentary democracy, holding a coalition together for 16 years is a statistical anomaly.
Right. It almost never happens.
It really doesn't. The natural gravity of democratic politics is cyclical. Governments accumulate baggage, voters get angry about a specific crisis, and the pendulum swings. But Fidesz defied that gravity for a very long time.
And now they are sitting in the opposition.
Yes, representing roughly 2.5 million voters. And to understand how they ended up there, you have to look at the incredibly counterintuitive argument Balázs Orbán makes about their defeat.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this is where the psychology gets absolutely fascinating to me. You would assume a government loses power because they, drove the country off a cliff, right?
Right, like a huge disaster.
Yeah, a massive economic depression, a catastrophic scandal, cities burning. But Balázs Orbán argues the exact opposite. He claims they lost because they were too successful.
It sounds crazy, but his logic is really interesting.
He asserts that Fidesz delivered a flourishing economy, impeccably clean streets, and incredibly safe cities, primarily by maintaining very strict, closed borders and constantly shielding the country from the edicts of what he calls the Brussels elite.
The psychological phenomenon of voter fatigue is the hidden engine of this entire shift.
Hmm.
I mean, you have to consider the macroeconomic environment over the last 4 years.
It's been chaotic everywhere.
Exactly. Right next door to Hungary,
Yeah.
you have the largest land war in Europe since World War II. Across the continent, you have skyrocketing energy prices heavily driven by the severing of Russian gas supplies, and you have massive crippling inflation.
Just a mess.
But Balázs argues that the Fidesz government engaged in this daily high-wire act of crisis management to insulate the Hungarian population from all that chaos. I mean, they subsidized energy, they fought off external inflation pressures, and they basically maintained this bubble of stability.
But the electorate's memory of past volatility just fades. It's like the IT department at a massive, complex corporation.
Oh, I love this analogy.
Think about it. When everything works perfectly, the servers are humming, there are no data breaches, the Wi-Fi never drops, the executives walking around the office start to wonder why they're even paying this massive cybersecurity team.
Right, because they don't see the fires being put out.
Exactly. They get bored of the invisible stability. They look at the budget and think, we haven't had a system crash in 5 years. Let's fire half the IT guys and buy some flashy new software.
Yes.
They crave change simply because the absence of problems feels like stagnation. The extraordinary effort required to maintain that stability becomes completely invisible to the people benefiting from it.
That invisible effort is a profound political vulnerability. If a government successfully neutralizes external threats, the electorate's hierarchy of needs fundamentally shifts.
How so?
Well, if you aren't worried about violent crime or whether you can afford to heat your home, you move past basic security and economic survival. You start looking for new narratives.
You have the luxury to care about other things.
Exactly. You start focusing on secondary desires, on social issues, or simply on the aesthetic fatigue of seeing the exact same politicians on your television screen for 16 years.
So, is it actually possible for a government to be too successful at insulating a population? Because according to the source, the new Prime Minister, Peter Magyar, saw this exact psychological shift and explained it perfectly.
He really did.
Balázs Orbán notes that Magyar adopted rhetoric that would sound incredibly familiar to anyone who followed the 2008 U.S. presidential election. It was the pure language of hope and change.
Very Obama-esque.
Yeah, he promised the electorate a brighter, more progressive, more modern future. But here is the brilliant, manipulative hook, at least according to Balázs. Magyar promised all of this novelty without asking the voters to give up any of the security or economic stability they currently enjoyed.
It is the ultimate political free lunch.
Ex-
I mean, when you run against an entrenched incumbent who has built a stable society, you do not attack the stability.
Right, you don't say you're going to ruin the economy.
No, you assure the voters, yes, the streets will stay safe. Yes, the economy will remain strong. I am not going to touch the things you like. I'm just going to remove the corruption, modernize our tone, and give us a fresh start.
And for the voter experiencing that IT department fatigue, it feels like a risk-free software upgrade.
Exactly.
I think everyone listening can relate to this dynamic on a personal level. Think about a time you made a massive life change. Maybe you left a perfectly stable, decent-paying job, or you walked away from a comfortable, safe relationship. There was no catastrophic abuse, no bankruptcy. You just felt stagnant. You craved that feeling of hope and change, and you convinced yourself the grass would automatically be greener.
And it often isn't.
Right. It wasn't until months or years later that you realized there were massive hidden costs to the stability you just cavalierly left behind. Balázs Orbán is essentially diagnosing this exact human impulse, but applied to a national electorate of millions.
And that diagnosis brings us to a much darker assertion in the source material. Balázs Orbán doesn't just view this as a natural psychological phenomenon of the Hungarian voter.
No, he goes much further.
He argues that this specific desire for a risk-free upgrade was systematically weaponized by outside forces. This is what we call the centrist Trojan horse playbook.
Yes, the source text pivots here from local Hungarian politics to a sweeping indictment of the Brussels mainstream. Balázs claims that what happened with Peter Magyar was orchestrated.
He thinks it's a deliberate strategy.
That there is a specific, repeatable strategy used across Europe to systematically dismantle national conservative governments.
Look at the mechanics of this alleged strategy as he outlines it. What's fascinating here is how formulaic it is. Step 1. Identify a young, highly charismatic, often telegenic politician.
Okay.
Step 2. This politician must publicly brand themselves as a moderate right-winger or a pragmatic centrist. They use language that appeals to the conservative voter who is feeling that fatigue we just discussed. They present as a safe harbor.
But then comes step 3.
Right. Step 3 is where the trap is sprung. Once this figure gains enough electoral traction to deny the conservative incumbent an outright majority, they immediately pivot. They unite with the established leftist or progressive opposition to form a governing coalition.
And then step 4.
Step 4. They govern entirely from the left, implementing the very Brussels-aligned policies they obfuscated during the campaign.
He is literally saying the branding on the outside of the box says safe, moderate, conservative, but the moment you bring it inside the gates and open it up, the legislative product is hardline left-wing Brussels policy.
A literal Trojan horse.
Exactly. And he doesn't just speak in abstracts here. He points directly at other major European leaders who he claims are products of this exact same manufacturing line.
He specifically highlights Friedrich Merz in Germany. Now, Merz is the leader of the Christian Democratic Union, which is historically a conservative powerhouse.
Right.
But Balázs argues that while Merz presents a traditional conservative facade, the realities of German coalition politics mean he will inevitably ally with left-leaning parties like the Greens or the SPD, effectively neutralizing true conservative policy. He also points to Emmanuel Macron in France.
Now, Macron is the ultimate example of this, isn't he?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, he literally created a new centrist party out of thin air, pulled the moderate voters from both the traditional center-right and center-left, and just completely hollowed out the establishment parties.
Exactly. And the third example Balázs uses is Donald Tusk in Poland.
Yeah.
Tusk recently ousted the conservative Law and Justice Party, known as PS, which had been in power for 8 years.
Right. That was a huge shift.
It was. Tusk presented himself as a moderate, pro-European stabilizing force. But to govern, he formed this massive, unwieldy coalition that includes the far left. So in Balázs Orbán's view, these aren't isolated organic national elections.
He sees a pattern.
He sees them as successful deployments of a unified, supranational strategy designed by Brussels to purge national sovereignty advocates from European capital.
But wait, I have to push back on Balázs' premise here. Is this actually a nefarious, orchestrated playbook managed by globalists in Brussels, or is this simply the cold, mechanical reality of coalition politics in a parliamentary system?
That is the big question.
Because we are so used to the American first-past-the-post system, where it's a binary choice.
Yeah.
But in a multi-party European system, if you want to oust a dominant party that holds like 45% of the vote, you mathematically cannot do it from a pure ideological extreme.
The math just doesn't work.
Right. You have to find a centrist figure to capture the middle, and then you have to form an alliance of strange bedfellows from the center right to the far left, just to cross that 50% threshold.
So isn't Balázs Orbán just describing basic parliamentary math and calling it a conspiracy?
That is exactly the structural counterargument. A political scientist would look at Poland or Hungary and say, this is just the system working as designed.
Right.
Parliamentary systems are built on compromise. The centrist figure is just the necessary glue to hold a deeply fractured opposition together against a monolithic incumbent.
Makes total sense.
However, the crux of Balázs Orbán's argument isn't just about how these coalitions are formed, it's about what they do the absolute second they get their hands on the levers of power.
Ah, okay.
If it were just moderate, pragmatic coalition building, you would expect moderate, pragmatic governance. And that is the perfect pivot, because according to the source, the governance they are seeing is anything but moderate. The true test of this Trojan horse theory isn't the campaign, it's the immediate legislative action taken after the victory.
And they moved fast.
So fast. The new government didn't focus on tweaking tax rates or improving healthcare.
Yeah.
They wasted absolutely no time rewriting the foundational constitutional rules of the game.
We have to frame this within the historical accusations leveled against Fidesz to really understand the irony here. For a decade and a half, the Western press, officials in Brussels, and the domestic Hungarian opposition relentlessly labeled Viktor Orbán's government as autocratic, authoritarian, or even a dictatorship.
Right, that was the constant narrative.
Yet Balázs explicitly points out a glaring contradiction. When this supposed dictatorship lost the election, they conceded peacefully.
They just walked away.
They stepped down. Viktor Orbán didn't barricade himself in the parliament. 2.5 million conservative voters are now represented peacefully by the opposition.
Here's where it gets really interesting. He highlights the profound irony here. The supposedly autocratic regime engaged in a perfectly peaceful transfer of democratic power. Meanwhile, the new government, the one that campaigned on a platform of restoring democracy, fighting corruption, and bringing hope and change, immediately launched what can only be described as constitutional hardball.
It was incredibly aggressive.
They did it to permanently kneecap their political opponents.
The speed and aggression of these legal maneuvers are what Balázs finds so alarming. Rather than relying on the normal legislative process to debate policy, the new supermajority targeted the architecture of the state itself.
The specifics of these constitutional changes are basically surgical strikes against the conservative opposition. First, Balázs details a modification explicitly designed to ban a prime minister from serving more than 8 years.
Right, known as Lex Orbán.
Exactly. Because Viktor Orbán has already served 16 years, this constitutional amendment mathematically and legally prevents him from ever holding the office of prime minister again.
To understand why this is such a radical and aggressive maneuver, you have to understand the fundamental difference between a presidential system and a parliamentary system.
It's very different from the U.S.
Very. In the United States, in a presidential system, term limits are standard. The president is both the head of the state and the head of government. We have the 22nd Amendment limiting a president to 2 4-year terms because the system is designed to prevent an executive from amassing monarchical power over the military and the bureaucracy independent of the legislature.
It's completely normalized for American listeners. I mean, we expect our leaders to leave after 8 years.
But Hungary is a parliamentary system. In a parliamentary democracy, the prime minister is not directly elected by the public in a separate executive contest. The prime minister is simply the leader of the party or the coalition of parties that successfully holds the majority of seats in the parliament.
They are essentially chosen by their peers in the legislature.
Exactly. And their power is entirely contingent on maintaining the confidence of that legislature. If they lose a vote of no confidence, their government collapses instantly.
Just like that.
Because of this constant legislative accountability, term limits for prime ministers are virtually unheard of globally.
Right. Think about Angela Merkel in Germany. She was chancellor for 16 years. Tony Blair was the prime minister of the UK for a decade. Justin Trudeau has been prime minister of Canada for nearly a decade.
Exactly. If the populace continues to elect the party, and the party continues to select that individual as their leader, they remain in power. It is an ongoing mandate.
So slapping a term limit on it is weird.
Very weird. Imposing a retroactive 8-year hard cap on the premiership in a parliamentary system is not a standard democratic reform. It is a bespoke legal weapon designed exclusively to neutralize one specific political rival who happens to be historically popular.
And it didn't stop with Viktor Orbán. The source details another rule they pushed forward, terminating the mandates of members of parliament who have served for 12 years.
Another huge sweep.
Now, let's think about the mechanics of this. Who does a 12-year limit disproportionately wipe out? It wipes out the entrenched, experienced Fidesz right-wing politicians who have spent the last decade and a half building deep local networks, mastering parliamentary procedure, and accumulating institutional knowledge.
It is a legal purge of the conservative bench.
Exactly.
It forces a massive brain drain on the opposition.
Nah.
By stripping them of their most experienced operators, the new government ensures that even if Fidesz manages to win back voters in the future, they will be fielding a team of rookies who don't know how to navigate the complex machinery of the state.
It's ruthless.
It is. And the new government didn't just target the legislature, they went after the executive branch as well. Balázs outlines their attempt to oust the current president of Hungary.
Now, we should clarify for you listening that the president of Hungary is a largely symbolic role, unlike the prime minister.
Yes, the president is the head of state, focusing more on national unity and diplomacy, but they do possess a crucial mechanical power, the power to sign new laws or to refer controversial laws to the Constitutional Court for review.
Which is a huge roadblock if you're trying to push through radical changes.
Exactly. By attempting to terminate the current president's mandate prematurely, the new progressive supermajority aims to install a party loyalist. They want a president who will simply rubber stamp this massive legislative overhaul without introducing any friction or legal challenges.
I keep coming back to a corporate analogy for this. Imagine a highly successful company. The founder has run it for 16 years. Profits are up, the market share is stable, the employees are paid on time.
Sounds like a great company.
But then a new board of directors manages to win a proxy vote by promising the shareholders a sleeker, more modern corporate culture. So the new board steps in. But the very first thing they do isn't to launch a new product or improve customer service or increase dividends. The very first thing they do is call a late-night meeting to rewrite the fundamental corporate bylaws to explicitly state that the old founder can literally never be hired back under any circumstances. And they instantly fire any middle manager who has been at the company longer than a decade.
It signals a profound institutional insecurity.
Exactly. Doesn't this reek of terror? As Balázs openly asks Dave Rubin in the Source interview, if this new prime minister, Peter Magyar, is so supremely confident in his mandate from the people, if his policies are so clearly superior, why is he legally terrified of letting the voters have the option to choose Viktor Orbán in the future?
It's a great question.
Why not just beat him at the ballot box again?
Because changing the foundational rules of the game is permanent, whereas winning an election is temporary. By baking these restrictions into the Constitution, they're ensuring that even if the electorate experiences buyer's remorse in 2 years, the structural barriers to a conservative resurgence are insurmountable.
It's all about locking in the power.
Right. And Balázs highlights the hypocrisy of this focus by bringing up the new government's campaign promises. He claims they made 1,213 specific economic promises to the voters.
Wow, that's a lot of promises.
Yeah, things like raising salaries, lowering taxes, dropping the unemployment rate.
But according to the interview, in their first 50 to 60 days in power, they have completely ignored every single one of those economic promises. Their entire legislative bandwidth has been consumed by punishing political opponents and securing their own power architecture.
It is a dizzying, whiplash-inducing pace of constitutional change.
But the legal framework isn't the only thing changing at light speed. And that brings us to the absolute core of Fidesz's historical identity and the fastest reversal of all: national sovereignty, specifically regarding the border and culture.
For 16 years, the defining characteristic of the Fidesz government, the brand identity that made them famous or infamous, depending on your perspective across the globe, was their hardline stance on national sovereignty.
They were dug in.
Very. According to Balázs Orbán, they spent tremendous financial resources, quoting him, paying €1 million every day to maintain physical border security and to resist the cultural and legal edicts flowing out of Brussels.
They viewed themselves as the final bulwark of traditional Central European culture. But within roughly 2 months of the new government taking power, Balázs reports a complete 180-degree cultural and legal reversal.
Total whiplash again.
He paints a very vivid picture of the visual change, stating simply, rainbow flags are now all over the streets of Hungary. But beyond the cultural symbolism, the structural change is massive. The new government immediately adopted the EU Migration Pact.
This is the critical mechanism we need to explore. The EU Migration Pact is the white whale that Fidesz fought against for years. It is central to Balázs Orbán's thesis about the intentional dismantling of European nation-states.
It's a huge deal.
To understand why he views it as an existential threat, we have to look at the two highly controversial pillars that make up this pact.
Let's break those down, because this isn't just abstract political theory. This is the literal physical management of human beings crossing borders. What is the first pillar of this pact?
The first pillar is the mathematical forced reallocation of migrants across the European Union.
Meaning what, exactly?
Under this new regulation, the processing and settling of migrants is no longer the sole responsibility of the country where they physically arrive. If a massive wave of migrants enters the EU by landing on the shores of Italy or Spain, Brussels now calculates a quota based on the GDP and population of every other member state.
So if you are a listener, think about your own hometown, your own county or state. Imagine if an international body located thousands of miles away suddenly mandated that your local community was legally obligated to take in a specific quota of migrants who had crossed the border of a completely different state.
All right.
And your local elected officials had absolutely no legal recourse to say, we don't have the housing capacity, or our voters do not support this.
That is the exact friction. It fundamentally removes a sovereign nation's ability to control its own demographics. Hungary, despite being geographically distant from the Mediterranean sea routes, and despite having a domestic policy of closed borders, is now legally mandated by Brussels to absorb these populations or face massive financial penalties.
So the local voter is just completely bypassed.
The decision-making power is centralized in supranational institutions, stripping the local voter of their agency regarding who lives in their community.
That is a massive surrender of sovereign power. And that is only the first half of the equation. What is the second pillar of the pact?
The second pillar, which Balázs Orbán finds even more destructive to the concept of nation-state, is the legal obligation for member states to construct massive refugee camps.
Okay, but camps have always existed, right?
Yes, but the crucial detail here is the nature of these camps. Balázs stresses that the pact does not allow for closed, secure processing facilities where individuals are detained while their asylum claims are vetted and their backgrounds are checked.
Wait, really?
The pact mandates open camps.
He explicitly calls this a dangerous suicidal experiment in the interview. He argues that the fundamental concept of border protection is binary. It is physics. You either stop individuals at the physical border and do not permit them entry into the country until they are fully vetted and legally approved, or you lose control entirely.
Once they are in, they are in.
Right. The moment you are legally forced to build open camps inside your sovereign territory, where individuals are free to walk out the front gate and integrate into the surrounding towns and cities before their claims are processed, your border control is functionally dead.
This specific policy highlights the profound, irreconcilable philosophical tension at the heart of the European Union today.
It's two completely different worldviews.
Exactly. On one side, you have the traditional conservative principle, championed by Orbán, that a nation's most fundamental duty is to control its physical territory, protect its citizens, and determine its own demographic future.
And the other side.
On the other side, you have the collective mandate of the EU, driven by progressive and centrist coalitions, which views migration as a shared humanitarian burden that must be distributed collectively across the continent, prioritizing international human rights law over localized border sovereignty.
Balázs shares an anecdote in the interview that perfectly captures this philosophical divide. He talks about walking through the courtyard of the European Parliament in Brussels. He wanders into an area largely controlled by the Green Party, and he sees these massive signs plastered everywhere saying, "Refugees, welcome, bring your families and relatives, we let all of them in."
It's a very different mindset.
He makes a dark joke that he only survived walking through there because they didn't recognize his face. But the anecdote points to a very stark reality. It shows how incredibly fast a nation's physical landscape can change.
Unbelievably fast.
You vote for a charismatic guy promising hope and change because you are bored of the incumbent, and 60 days later, the legal gates of your country are thrown wide open, and the construction of open-air camps begins.
The speed is what makes it a paradigm shift, rather than just a transition. And that rapid shift in philosophy, from sovereign isolation to full integration with the Brussels consensus, doesn't stop at internal European migration.
No, it bleeds into foreign policy, too.
It extends all the way to the front lines of the bloodiest conflict in Europe in 80 years.
Which brings us to the geopolitical shockwaves. The Fidesz government's stance on the war in Ukraine was arguably its most universally controversial policy on the global stage.
Oh, without a doubt.
Their position, as laid out in the interview, was to keep Hungary entirely, absolutely out of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. They advocated for an immediate ceasefire and resisted sending weapons, military aid, or getting entangled in the proxy war.
That isolationist stance deeply infuriated both the European Union leadership in Brussels and the American administration in Washington. Hungary was viewed as the stubborn roadblock to a unified Western front against Russian aggression.
But the new guys changed that immediately.
Yes. The source indicates that the new administration, under Peter Magyar, immediately reversed this course. They aligned Hungary seamlessly with the Western consensus. They are now supporting Ukraine financially, supplying weapons and military equipment, and, crucially, they greenlit Ukraine's fast-track accession into the European Union.
Let's talk about that fast-track accession, because Balázs Orbán views bringing Ukraine into the EU as a catastrophic existential risk for Europe. We generally hear about EU membership as this wonderful democratic aspiration for Ukraine. Why is it seen as such a danger from his perspective?
Because it represents a massive collision between idealistic political solidarity and the cold, brutal realities of economic survival. We have to look at the mechanics of the European common market.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Ukraine is a massive country. Geographically, it is huge, and it possesses an enormous agricultural sector built on some of the most fertile black soil on the planet. But crucially, their agricultural sector operates on massive industrial-scale corporate farms with significantly lower labor costs and different regulatory standards than the EU.
So, what happens when you plug that massive machine into the EU market?
If you fast-track their entry without the standard, grueling, decade-long vetting and economic integration processes, you're suddenly dropping EU tariffs overnight.
Which means?
This means a tidal wave of incredibly cheap Ukrainian grain floods the European market. It instantly undercuts local farmers in neighboring countries like Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary, who operate smaller, family-owned farms and have to comply with expensive EU environmental regulations. It completely collapses local agricultural pricing models.
Wow. It is the ultimate example of unintended consequences. The politicians in Brussels act out of a desire for political solidarity with an embattled neighbor, but the mechanism they use accidentally bankrupts their own food supply chain.
Exactly. And Balazs places this specific Ukraine agricultural crisis within a much larger, frankly terrifying macro assessment of Europe's strategic vulnerability. He argues that Europe is currently fighting a three-front war, and they are losing on all three fronts simultaneously.
Let's explore the mechanics of this three-front war because it really crystallizes the conservative critique of current European leadership. What is the first front?
The first front is the proxy war with Russia. Historically, Russia was the primary provider of cheap, abundant energy, specifically natural gas, that powered Europe's, and specifically Germany's, massive industrial base.
Right.
By engaging in the proxy war and enacting severe sanctions, Europe has severed itself from the energy engine that made its factories globally competitive.
Okay, so the cheap energy is gone. What is the second front?
The second front is the trade war with China. Europe desperately needs massive amounts of Chinese technology, specifically solar panels, wind turbines, and EV batteries, to meet the aggressive green energy goals set by Brussels.
But there's a cat.
However, Europe is also simultaneously trying to slap heavy tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles to protect their domestic auto manufacturers from being completely wiped out. It is a schizophrenic economic policy of relying on a partner you are actively trying to penalize.
Ouch. And the third front?
The third front is the political and technological war with the United States. Europe has positioned itself as the regulatory superpower of the world. They pass sweeping legislation like the GDPR for data privacy and the new AI Act.
Right, they love to regulate.
But they aren't actually building the technology. The United States is building the AI, the massive tech platforms, the cloud infrastructure. Europe is strictly a consumer trying to regulate the American producer.
So what does this all mean for the average European? If you synthesize those three fronts, it means Europe has systematically isolated itself from the cheap energy it needs to run its factories. It is alienating the Chinese markets it relies on for its green transition. And it is in a regulatory cold war with the American technological alliance it needs for future innovation.
It's not a great position to be in.
It is a brutal, self-inflicted trifecta of vulnerability.
And this structural vulnerability naturally leads Balázs Orbán to look outward for solutions, specifically toward the United States and the potential for a new, aggressive transatlantic alliance of conservatives. The interview with Dave Rubin touched heavily on American politics. Balázs openly and enthusiastically praises Donald Trump and J.D. Vance.
He does, and his praise is specifically centered on their rhetoric. He says that when figures like Trump and Vance use incredibly harsh, direct language regarding the European migration problem, when they talk about closed borders and mass deportations, they aren't being anti-European.
No, he says they are just being honest.
Right. He claims they are simply telling the truth. He argues that every rational private citizen in Europe knows it is the truth, but their leaders are too terrified of the Brussels media apparatus to say it out loud.
He is calling for a united front. He believes that Western national conservatives in the U.S. and in pockets of Europe must come together to fundamentally rewrite the international legal frameworks that currently govern the globe.
That is a massive undertaking.
It is. He is targeting the United Nations Conventions on Refugees and the interpretations of international human rights courts. He believes these supranational frameworks have evolved to make it legally impossible for a sovereign nation to actually defend its own borders from demographic shifts.
He essentially wants a coordinated effort to tear up the post-World War II legal consensus on asylum and replace it with a framework that prioritizes the nation-state above the migrant. But here is where I think we need to introduce a heavy dose of demographic reality.
Yeah, we have to look at the ground truth.
And I noted this pushback occurring within the source material's broader context as well. Even if this conservative alliance forms, and even if Trump wins in the U.S., and even if you rewrite the UN Charter to allow for aggressive border closures and mass deportations, well, the sheer brutal math in Europe is completely different than in America.
The demographic realities are fundamentally distinct.
Right. In the U.S., the debate is largely about the physical southern border and recent arrivals. But in Western European countries like the UK, France, and Germany, the migration issue isn't just happening at a border checkpoint anymore. It is deeply homegrown.
It's embedded in the society.
Yes, you are dealing with second and third generation populations. You have massive, unassimilated demographic blocks living in the banlieues of Paris or the suburbs of London. Extricating Europe from this crisis, if you adopt Orbán's premise that it is a crisis, is an incredibly complex generational undertaking.
It's not as simple as closing a door.
It is not just about locking a gate, it is about figuring out what to do with millions of people who are already legally inside the house, many of whom hold citizenship.
That is the immovable object confronting the right-wing populist force. Balázs acknowledges that Hungary is a unique case study because Fidesz largely succeeded in keeping the initial massive waves of migration out over the last decade. For Hungary, the problem is still largely theoretical and concentrated at the border.
But for the rest of Europe,
But for Western Europe, the demographic shift has already fundamentally altered the fabric of the society. The numbers are so massive that enacting the kind of deportations or radical social restructuring that national conservatives advocate for would require a level of state force and societal friction that almost no mainstream European leader has the political capital or the willingness to actually execute.
which perfectly explains why the centrist Trojan horse playbook is so effective, even if it's not a conspiracy.
Exactly.
The machinery required to actually reverse the demographic trends in Western Europe is so daunting, so legally perilous, and so likely to cause massive civil unrest that it is infinitely easier for a politician to campaign on being tough on migration, but then govern as a centrist once they get into power.
It's the path of least resistance.
It is easier to just manage the decline, build the open camps Brussels demands, and hope the voters are too distracted by the new hope and change rhetoric to notice the reality on the ground.
As we step back and synthesize everything we have covered in this deep dive into Balázs Orbán's perspective, the primary takeaways are quite striking, regardless of your personal politics. First, we've been given a vivid, mechanical demonstration of how fragile political permanence truly is.
It's terrifyingly fragile.
A 16-year, deeply entrenched conservative architecture, complete with a thriving economy and secure borders, was dismantled and structurally neutralized by a new supermajority in just 60 days.
It is a masterclass in the ruthless application of power. Second, we see the profound, unyielding tension between the concept of strict national sovereignty, the right of a local community to govern itself, and the relentless centralizing force of globalist or supranational alliances like the EU, which seek to distribute burdens like migration collectively.
And third, it highlights the whiplash-inducing speed of the political pendulum in the modern era. You can go from a nation that proudly defines itself to the world by its closed borders and traditional values, to a nation erecting open refugee camps and flying progressive flags almost overnight.
It really makes you reflect on your own local and national politics, doesn't it? Think about the policies where you live right now that you consider completely permanent, the bedrock laws of your society that you assume will always be there.
We all have them.
How much of that permanence is just an illusion? How much of your current political reality is actually just a few obscure constitutional tweaks and one highly charismatic hope and change campaign away from being entirely erased?
It is a sobering thought regarding the fragility of societal consensus. We like to believe that laws are carved in stone, but the rules of the game are only ever as permanent as the people currently holding the pen.
And that leads me to a final provocative thought. This wasn't explicitly debated by Balázs Orbán in the Source interview, but it builds directly on everything we've unpacked today. In the interview, Balázs asserts with absolute, unwavering confidence that Central Europe is inherently a common-sense-based society.
He says that multiple times.
He firmly believes that this new progressive government under Peter Magyar is just a temporary aberration. He believes that eventually the voters will realize they were tricked by this centrist Trojan horse, they will recognize the dangers of the EU migration pact, and they will naturally return to their conservative roots to protect their nation.
He thinks the pendulum will swing back.
But it raises a much deeper question for you to mull over. Is common sense actually an objective, immovable baseline that a human society will always naturally regress to when threatened? Or is common sense just a comforting, subjective label we apply to whatever political reality we happen to grow up with?
That cuts to the core of generational memory. If stability makes you forget the crisis, does a new normal make you forget the old common sense?
Exactly. Because if common sense is strictly defined by what you're used to, then maybe this new progressive government isn't a temporary glitch at all. Maybe by rapidly changing the Constitution, opening the borders to new demographics, and radically shifting the cultural symbols on the streets, they aren't destroying the baseline. They are successfully creating an entirely new common sense for the next generation of
A
voters.
completely new paradigm.
And if they succeed in doing that, a decade from now, the 16-year Fidesz era won't be remembered as the golden age of common sense. It will be remembered as the weird, conservative aberration. We started this deep dive talking about how stepping into this political landscape is like navigating the diagnostic aftermath of a massive earthquake. Well, when the ground finally stops shaking and the dust eventually settles, the map you used to rely on isn't just outdated. It describes a world that simply no longer exists.